Last time we spoke about the siege of Myitkyina. General Vinegar Joe made huge gains in northern Burma. Myitkyina's airstrip was taken, now the main town was under siege. The Japanese resistance around Kamang was also greatly reduced. However, setbacks were also seen, such as the Chindit's abandonment of the Blackpool stronghold, prompting Stilwell to toss a new attack at Magong. Likewise, American officers embedded with the Chinese units were sending reports of how the Chinese were suffering very heavy casualties and utilizing far too much ammunition for their objectives. Regardless, it seemed the Ledo road to China was going to pan out. Calvert chose a new stronghold location, this time at Lakum, where his Chindits faced heavy resistance. Over on New Guinea, the Allies were advancing west of their new beachheads to assault Lone Tree Hill. Soon assaults against Harare and Biak would also be made. This episode is The Landing Against Biak. Welcome back to the Pacific War Podcast week by week, and I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about World War II? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on World War II, and so much more, so give them a look over at YouTube. So please, subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at The Age of Conquest, The Fall and Rise of China podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Over there I'm releasing some long-format documentaries. The last one was on the opening of Japan and the Meiji Restoration. Also, please check out my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel, where for as little as $2 a month, you get access to the exclusive Patreon podcast, early access to all of my content, and voting rights for what I'll tackle next. Check it out. In the last episode, plans were made for an amphibious assault against Biak, yet there were some hiccups. The Hurricane Task Force staged at Humboldt Bay were facing issues with terrain. Terrain considerations forced most of the task force to assemble on the southern two sand spits dividing Humboldt and Tutufa Bay. On this part of the beach, it had a very steep slope, which made it impossible for only a few LSTs to get ashore long enough to load the bulk stores. The LSTs had to beach on the northern spit, where clearing and salvage after the fires and explosions, which had ravaged the beach during the early phases of the Hollandia operation, had not been completed. In addition, the northern spit was being used to unload supplies destined to be used at Hollandia, to load supplies being sent to the Tornado Task Force at Waktisarme, and to unload cargo for the Hurricane Task Force. No road connected the northern and southern sand spits. Consequently, most of the supplies and equipment, as well as many of the troops, had to be transported by water from the southern to the northern loading area. There were only a few LCTs available for this work, and only by working 24 hours a day were all the troops and supplies transported to the loading beach in time for the departure on the 25th. Finally, General Fuller's task force was to depart the bay on the evening of May the 25th, covered by Admiral Fetcheller's cruisers and destroyers. Taking the most direct route, the convoy would be able to arrive off Biak on the morning of May the 27th. At the same time, Biak was held by the Biak Detachment under Colonel Kizuna Naoki. His forces consisted of the 222nd Regiment, the 19th Guard Unit, some rear echelon, service, and construction units as well. Roughly 10,000 IJ personnel, 4,000 were combat troops in total, and about 2,000 IJN personnel, of which 125 were combat troops in total. In view of the intense enemy concentration on the Sorito-Mokmer airfield sector, Colonel Kizuna decided on May the 22nd to shift the operational center of gravity of the detachment to the west. The 1st Battalion 222nd Infantry was relieved of its mission in the sector east of Oparif, and they were sent to replace the naval garrison unit in the Bosnik sector. The naval troops were in turn shifted westwards into the Sorito airfield sector, while the tank company was brought over from Arfak Saba and assembled in an area northwest of the Mokmer airfield. Although most of the Japanese efforts had been directed to the construction of airfields, Kizuna had ably managed to build a system of strong cave positions. In this amphitheater-like terrain, and along the low ridge, both of which were covered by thick growth, The Biak detachment emplaced many field artillery and anti-aircraft weapons. There were also many automatic weapons and a few mortars. All of these weapons were located within range of the Mokmer drone, and most of them could also fire on the Baroko drone. The key to Colonel Kizuna's defenses in the area was the West Caves area, located about 50 yards north of the low ridge, and about 1,200 yards north of the western end of the Mokmer drone. The West Caves were actually 3 large sumps, or depressions in the ground, which were connected by underground tunnels and caverns. The caves were ringed with pillboxes, bunkers, and foxholes, with an extensive system of coral and log emplacements built along the spur ridge above Mokmer drone. Biak Naval Headquarters were originally located in the West Caves, which could shelter about 1,000 men, and Colonel Kizuna planned to move Biak's detachment headquarters to the caves for the final defense of the airdromes. As long as the West Caves and the positions along the low ridge were occupied by the Japanese, Allied planes could not safely use the airfields. Chief of Staff of the Second Area Army, Lieutenant General Tumata Takezo, and Rear Admiral Tenda Satatoshi, commander of the 28th Special Base Force, with HQ at Monokawari, had come to visit the garrison just as the Allies were about to prepare their invasion, with Numata choosing to stay on the island to direct the battle alongside the resourceful Kizuna. Yet all of the Japanese at Biak were about to be caught with their pants down, as many of their troops were scattered about the island. The Biak detachment would not be in their defensive positions on Z-Day, but were apparently being held mobile. Detachment headquarters, the 1st Battalion of the 222nd Infantry, about half of the 19th Naval Guard Unit, and other miscellaneous units were located in a cave and a garden area on the island plateau about 3,000 yards northwest of Bosnek. Outposts at Saiba and Opiref were held by the 1st Company 222nd Infantry, and a platoon of the 2nd Company were stationed along the main ridge behind Bosnek. The bulk of the 2nd Battalion, the rest of the Naval Guard Unit, and some naval anti-aircraft organizations were located in the East Caves. Naval Headquarters, various naval service units, and the 6th Company 222nd Infantry were located at the West Caves. Most of the Army service units were at the Mokmer drone or disposed along the low ridge north of that field. The bulk of the 3rd Battalion were posted at the west end of the same airfield. One platoon of the 10th Company was at Sordo, guarding the southern terminus of the trail, which led north across the island to Koram Bay. The tanks had not yet moved to Saba, but were assembled at the terrace north of the eastern end of the Mokmer drone. On the morning of May the 27th, Bechsteller carried on his naval fire support as planned, as General Kenny's bombers also launched their aerial bombardment, receiving little answering fire from the surprised Japanese shore installations. Yet there was a westerly current of Biak that would push the transports over 3,000 yards to the west, which would complicate the landings. A rocket-equipped LCI, which began firing on the beaches about H-4 minutes, led the first LVT wave towards the shore. The LCI fire consisted of rockets and fire from automatic weapons, continued until H+2 minutes, which was lifted because it began to endanger the troops who were unloading and pushing inland. The first waves of the LVTs then formed rapidly and crossed the line of departure, but because of the westerly current and the smoke and dust raised by the preliminary bombardment, they would end up landing on a mangrove swamp almost 3,000 yards west of Green Beach 4. Nevertheless, by 7:30 a.m., the 2nd Battalion 186th Regiment had successfully landed and was pushing beyond the swamps to the main coastal road connecting Bosnek and the airfields. 5 minutes later, Companies I and K of Colonel Newman's 186th Regiment also landed about 700 yards east of the 2nd Battalion. Realizing about the westerly current, Bechsteller then started to turn succeeding waves eastward to the proper beaches, with the troops coming ashore in disorder for the next 30 minutes or so. With more than half of his regiment already far west of the proper landing beaches, and knowing that the landings had become quite disorganized and that the rest of the boat waves were being delayed, Colonel Newman asked the task force commander if the 186th Regiment could continue with its original mission or whether it might be feasible to switch missions with the 162nd Regiment and start moving west towards the airfield. General Fuller, the task force commander, ordered the 186th Regiment to continue with its original mission. As events turned out, it might have been better had the regiment continued west, as it was possible that a great deal of time might have been saved if the missions had been switched. In the first place, the maps with which the task force were supplied were so inaccurate that both regiments soon came upon terrain features that threw much of their planning out of gear. Secondly, most of the 186th Regiment had landed so far west that both it and the 162nd consumed much valuable time just getting to their proper locations. Finally, an exchange of missions might have been executed without much difficulty. For in amphibious training, the 41st Division had learned to switch missions when such mistakes were made. Luckily, the landings would face no real opposition, though the confusion would give Kizuna time to prepare his own defenses. By 8 a.m., the rest of Newman's 3rd Battalion had landed to secure the jetties, and by 10:30, Companies I and K arrived to take their position west of the old jetty. Entangled with the landed artillery and tanks, the 2nd Battalion would only be able to reach the area east of the new jetty by noon, then sending patrols to the north and east to secure the Bosniak perimeter. The face of the coral ridge behind Bosniak was found to be rough and honeycombed with small caves. Companies F and G, aided by elements of the support battery, 542nd Engineer Boat, and Shore Regiment, sent patrols along the steep slope and to the top of the ridge to investigate many of the caves, most of which proved to be unoccupied, though 3 Japanese were killed near some caves directly north of the new jetty. The companies moved over the first slope to the second ridge line, which were parallel to and about 75 yards north of the first. Company G started looking for a trail which was thought to be leading over the ridges to the plateau north of Bosniak, but it was Company E which, shortly after noon, found the ill-defined track. A few Japanese from the 2nd Company 222nd Regiment in a pillbox temporarily prevented the 2 companies from securing the trail, which was not cleared until 2 p.m. after the pillbox had been destroyed. During the late afternoon, patrols were sent north of the ridges to the area which the Japanese had surveyed for an airdrome. A few Japanese, most of whom had fled upon being sighted, were found at the airdrome site, but there were no signs of large organized enemy groups north, northeast, or east of the Bosniak, insofar as the 186th Infantry could ascertain. The only enemy action during this day would be an air attack by 4 Japanese bombers. A few enemy planes which flew over the Biak around noon fled before anti-aircraft guns from the ship or the shore could be brought to bear. But all the anti-aircraft crews were on alert to expect further Japanese air action late in the afternoon. Because of the difference in time of sunset and the closest Allied and Japanese bases, Japanese aircraft could remain in the Biak area about half an hour after Allied planes had to leave. The expected attacks developed shortly after 4 p.m., when 4 Japanese 2-engine bombers accompanied by 3 or 4 fighters approached the beachhead from the north, flying low over the ridge behind Bosniak and thus escaping radar detection. Some excellent targets were ready for the Japanese. Admiral Fitzteller had permitted 4 LSTs to tie up side by side as to one of the jetties. Although he knew this move to be tactically unsound, he considered it justified because of the importance of the cargo aboard the LSTs, and because the jetty provided the only good spot for the LST beaching. The Japanese bombing was accurate, but the LSTs were lucky. None of the Japanese bombs exploded. Though the Japanese planes also bombed and strafed the beaches, none of the bombs dropped to shore exploded, while the strafing runs killed only a single man and wounded 2 others. All 4 bombers were shot down by ground or ship-based anti-aircraft fire, and the Japanese fighters were driven off by some Allied fighter planes, which had remained in the area quite late. 1 Japanese bomber crashed into the water, sideswiping an SC, which was standing ashore. 2 of the ship's crew were killed and 9 were wounded. The SC had to be towed away for repairs, and a few other naval vessels suffered some minor damage from strafing. There was negligible damage to the supplies and equipment ashore as well. Thus, total Allied losses as a result of the air raid were 3 killed and 14 wounded, most of them naval personnel. Unloading also progressed satisfactorily, with 12,000 men, 12 medium tanks, 29 artillery pieces, about 500 vehicles, and an estimated 3,000 tons of bulk cargo being landed by 5:15 p.m. Meanwhile, Colonel Haney's 162nd Regiment had just begun landing ashore at 9 a.m., and immediately started moving west along the main coastal road towards Biak's 3 airdromes. Moving with speed, the 3rd Battalion passed through Ibdi village at 10:30, and then began to traverse the difficult Parai defile. At 11:15, the Regimental Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon discovered an enemy position on the face of a cliff west of Ibdi, and then the 162nd Infantry first learned of the existence of the Parai defile. At 1 p.m., the 3rd Battalion, with 6 tanks of the 603rd Tank Company leading the advance, arrived at the eastern entrance to the defile. There was no large Japanese force stationed along the cliff, but a few Japanese had such a tactical advantage over troops moving along the coastal road that they were able to delay the 162nd Infantry's advance for some time. Meanwhile, Company E, which had been attempting to advance along the ridge north of the rest of the regiment, had found that the terrain and thick vegetation made progress along the route nearly impossible. Since the company was lagging far behind the rest of the advance, and since strong enemy opposition had not yet been encountered either inland or on the coastal route, it withdrew to join the rest of the 2nd Battalion on the beach. By the time that battalion had reached Parai, Company E was back in place. By 3 p.m., the 3rd Battalion had successfully pushed through the defile and had secured Parai and a large jetty at the village. Progress west of the Parai defile was without noteworthy incident during the rest of the afternoon, so Haney's 2nd and 3rd Battalion would be able to dig in at the Parai by nightfall. On the other side, Kizuna was surprised by the landings, but he was expecting the enemy to land exactly there, where the extreme narrowness of the beach and a few entrances inland would make deployment difficult. Deciding to seize this momentary advantage, he thus ordered his 1st and 3rd Battalions to carry out an attack along the Bosnek beachhead during the night. On the 3rd Battalion front, after an unsuccessful raid against 2 batteries near Ibdi, the 3rd Battalion, 202nd Infantry renewed their attack with grenades and rifle fire, some circling to the north around Battery C, and a few others moving against Battery B, located 200 yards to the east. Attacks on Battery C continued until daylight when the Japanese finally withdrew. The action cost Battery C 4 men killed and 8 wounded, while a nearby anti-aircraft detachment lost 1 man killed and 1 man wounded. Over 15 of the enemy had been killed during the night, and an unknown number were wounded. The 1st Battalion had also raided the beachhead, suffering minor casualties as a result. On the morning of May the 28th, the 162nd then resumed its westward advance, with the 3rd Battalion rapidly proceeding through Mokmer village without any opposition. By 9:30, however, the Americans began to face stiff resistance at a road junction nearly 1,500 yards west of Mokmer. Supported by artillery, Company K would be able to push within 200 yards of the Mokmer drome, yet Kizuna would rapidly counterattack them with the 2nd Battalion. Charging repeatedly, the Japanese would eventually force the Americans to pull back by noon, with Lieutenant Yokoyama Hideo dying heroically during these attacks. Emboldened by his success, Kizuna then launched an all-out assault from the East Caves area. Along the main road ridge north of Mokmer, the Japanese had another strong point east of the West Caves, which was called by the Japanese the East Caves. Behind Mokmer, the ridge rose to a height of about 240 feet. It was not so steep as a cliff, as the Parai defile barricade, but it could not be climbed without use of hands. About 3/4 of the way to the top was a flat ledge from which 2 large caverns, similar to those of the West Caves area, could be entered. The Japanese constructed pillboxes on the right both below and above the ledge, and in the caverns they emplaced mortars, 200mm guns, and heavy machine guns. Observation posts were also set up in the East Caves, from which unobstructed view of the coast from Parai to the west end of the Mokmer drome could be obtained. The Biak detachment used the East Caves principally as living quarters, supply dumps, and a connecting link between the Ibdi pocket and the West Caves. Continued Japanese occupation of these caves would endanger Allied troop and supply movements along the coastal road from Parai to Mokmer drome. The enemy threw more troops into the battle from the East Caves area until the attackers were coming not only from the west but also from the northwest and north. The Japanese split the 3rd Battalion by driving a wedge along the cliff between the troops on the shore and those at the terrace. Companies L and M were cut off. The 2nd Battalion, attempting to get on the terrace to the north of the 3rd Battalion, were pinned down by Japanese fire from the East Caves. They were unable to advance. Company G on the terrace north of the main road and between the 2nd and 3rd Battalions were also cut off. In response to the attacks, Haney ordered the 1st Battalion to move north from Parai, onto the main coastal ridge to outflank the enemy positions, but efforts to do so were halted by enemy fire from these caves. 2 companies patrolled in the broken terrain along the main ridge were unable to move westward. Most of Company L and Company M's detachment, which had also been sent to the Coral Terrace, managed to find a covered route back to the rest of the 3rd Battalion on the shore, but one platoon initially surrounded had to fight its way eastward into the lines of the 2nd Battalion, north of the Mokmer village. Company G on the terrace north of the main road and between the 2nd and 3rd Battalions was also cut off. They had to withdraw, the 2nd Battalion only with difficulty, and after it suffered so many casualties from Japanese fire. During the afternoon, the 3rd Battalion stood off 2 more concerted enemy counterattacks, one at 12 p.m. and the other at around 2 p.m. They suffered more casualties from enemy mortar and artillery fire. During the later, the Japanese began moving some light tanks forward from the Mokmer drome area. The 3rd Platoon, 603rd Tank Company, engaged these tanks at a range of about 1,200 yards, and with the aid of fire from the destroyers lying offshore, they drove the enemy tanks back into the defiled positions. 3 tanks of the 603rd were damaged by artillery fire, and 3 men of the same organization were wounded during the action. Meanwhile, General Fuller had decided to reinforce the 3rd Battalion, 162nd Infantry. The 1st Platoon, 603rd Tank Company moved west along the coastal road. At the same time, small boats manned by the 542nd Engineer Boat and Shore Regiment were also sent forward with ammunition and medical supplies, both dangerously low. The small craft moved along the shore out of range of Japanese motor and artillery fire until opposite of the 3rd Battalion's position, and then they shot inshore at full speed, one by one. Supplies were replenished and the worst casualties evacuated despite continued shelling of the 3rd Battalion's position by the Japanese. The 1st and 2nd Battalions continued their efforts to clear the Japanese from the terrace behind the 3rd, but were met with little success. By the late afternoon, just as the 3rd Battalion's position was becoming untenable, Fuller gave up plans for further attempts at reinforcement. He ordered Haney to withdraw his 3rd Battalion. The withdrawal started slowly because of communication difficulties, still prevented the concentration of supported fire as well. However, at 5 p.m., the regimental commander finally ordered the 3rd Battalion to start moving back along the coastal road. Tanks were to act as point and rear guard, and close-in artillery fire was substituted for a disengaging force. The battalion was to continue eastward until it was passed through the 2nd, which was setting up a new defensive position east of Mokumer village. The men of the 3rd Battalion moved in small parties along the beach and main road, which was intermittently swept by Japanese mortar machine gun fire. Many troops were unable to use the main road, but had to drop down to the beach below the overhanging cliff. 4 tanks brought up the rear and protected the northern flank. Between 6:30 and 7, all elements of the 3rd Battalion reached safely beyond the 2nd Battalion's lines and began digging in for the night east of the later unit. Casualties for the day, almost all of them suffered by the 3rd Battalion, were about 16 deaths and 87 wounded. Facing strong resistance, he also decided to commit his tank company to the attack. At around 8 o'clock, new waves of Japanese infantry, now supported by 4 tanks, appeared west and north of the 2nd Battalion, thus beginning the first tank battle of the war in the Southwest Pacific area. The 2nd Battalion, 162nd Infantry, with the 1st Platoon, 603rd Tank Company in support, were astride the main coastal road about 1,000 yards east of Mokumer. The battalion's left flank was on the beach, while its right was against the coastal cliff, and less than 40 yards inland. Between the beach and the cliff was a coconut grove. The main coastal road crossed the rise of the cliff at a point about 475 yards west of the 2nd Battalion's lines. Shortly after 8 o'clock, the Japanese tanks, followed by the infantry columns, advanced down the incline where the main coastal road crossed the cliff, and they deployed in an echelon left formation in the Coconut Grove. The Japanese vehicles were light tanks, Type 95s, weighing about 9 tons, carrying a crew of about 3 men, and armed with 37mm cannons and 2 7.7mm machine guns. They were opposed to by 2 German Sherman M4A1 medium tanks, the heaviest armament of which was a 75mm. Each Japanese tank was stopped by 1 round of 75mm armor-piercing ammunition, while the enemy infantry was literally mowed down by machine guns and motors of the 2nd Battalion, 167 Infantry. Armor-piercing 75mm shells passed right through the Japanese light tanks, and the Shermans followed this up with a few rounds of 75mm high explosive, which tore holes in the Japanese vehicles and blew loose their turrets. During this action, several hits scored on the Shermans by the Japanese 37mm guns caused absolutely no damage. About 30 minutes after the first attack, the Japanese sent in a second wave of 3 tanks, which used the same route approach and the same formation in the Coconut Grove. These 3 tanks were quickly destroyed by the 3 Shermans. One enemy 37mm shell locked the 75mm gun of 1 Sherman in place, but the American tank backed partway into a shell hole to obtain elevation for its weapon and, despite the damage, managed to destroy one of the enemy tanks. The Japanese tanks, having been stopped and the leading elements of the 2nd Infantry Wave killed, the attack disintegrated as the enemy was forced to withdraw. For about an hour or so, the Japanese were quiet, but late in the morning, under the cover of machine gun fire and motor barrages, they began to circle north of the 2nd and 3rd Battalions, 162nd Infantry. New infantry attacks began at about 12 p.m. The enemy was unable to dislodge the 162nd Infantry, but their motor fire caused many casualties within the regimental perimeter, and the Japanese managed to cut the coastal road east of the large T-jetty at Parai. Company B and the Cannon Company counterattacked the Japanese roadblock behind close-in motor support, and they succeeded in dislodging the enemy by fire and movement. During the afternoon of May the 29th, the 162nd thus moved back to Parai, where the 2nd Battalion and 2 companies boarded some amphibious craft back to Bosnek, and the rest of the regiment moved overland through the Parai Defile and took up positions at Ibdi. The 162nd Infantry's casualties during the day were 16 deaths, 96 wounded, and 3 injured. The regiment estimated that they had killed over 500 Japanese during the day. Though Kuzume's forces had suffered massive casualties, they had heroically managed to stop the enemy advance, and would subsequently push troops forward to Parai and into the cliffs along the Parai Defile. They would, however, also lose most of their armor during these attacks. Only 5 tanks survived, and they were withdrawn to the western caves. Pending the arrival of reinforcements, General Fuller planned to use his available troops to hold the west flank at Ibdi and expand the beachhead at Bosnik. The 162nd Infantry was to establish a semicircular perimeter beginning on the beach west of Ibdi, reaching north to the main ridge, and then returning to the beach at the village. The 1st Battalion 186th Infantry would maintain a perimeter around Mondom, where the Hurricane Task Force HQ was located, while the 3rd Battalion moved over to the ridge behind Bosnik to set up defenses on the inland plateau. The 2nd Battalion, with part of the 3rd attached, would remain at the Bosnik beachhead. During this period, the 800 well-armed men of the 3rd Battalion 222nd Infantry at the MD Pocket made only harassing attacks with small groups against the positions of the 162nd Infantry. On the 30th and the 31st of May, the 162nd Infantry patrolled around the main ridge near Ibdi for a route over which large bodies of troops might come north to the inland plateau in preparation for the second attack going westwards. During the course of this patrolling, it was discovered that the main ridge from Bosnik to the Parai Defile actually comprised a series of 7 sharp coral ridges, the crests of which were 50 to 75 yards apart and separated by gullies 50 to 100 feet deep. The separate ridges were honeycombed with small natural caves, potholes, and crevices. There was little soil in most of the coral, yet the area maintained a cover of dense rainforest containing trees 8 to 20 inches thick and 100 to 100 feet high. The 162nd Infantry discovered 2 native trails over the ridges. The most easterly of these was designated the Old Man's Trail, beginning on a beach road about 1,200 yards west of Mondom. It was a fairly well-defined track which swung north over the 7 ridges along a comparatively easy route. Another track began 1,200 yards on the west near Ibdi. It was called the Young Man's Trail. The later followed a very difficult route over the ridges to the inland plateau. Both of these trails ran through the outer defenses of the Ibdi Pocket, into which the Biak detachment on May the 30th moved the 3rd Battalion 222nd Infantry. On the 30th and 31st, the 162nd Infantry's patrols along the ridges north of Ibdi and Mondom were harassed by the Japanese in the Ibdi Pocket, which had not yet been recognized as a major enemy stronghold point. On the 30th, the 162nd Infantry located a waterhole near the beach terminal of the Old Man's Trail. A regimental water point established there was constantly harassed by Japanese rifle fire from the Ibdi Pocket and by small enemy parties which moved down out of the ridges north of Ibdi and Mondom. The Cannon Company 162nd Infantry was therefore assigned the missions of clearing the enemy from the water point area and protecting that important installation from further Japanese attacks. Halfway through the Parai Defile, a little over a mile west of the 162nd Infantry's main perimeter, an underground stream ran from the base of the cliff into the Songarai Bay. At the point where the main road crossed the stream, the 162nd Infantry set up an ambush point to prevent Japanese infiltration from the west along the beach. The ambush site was also used as a patrol base for small parties to go over to the Parai Defile to discover enemy positions in the area. Patrolling on the 30th and the 31st of May cost the 162nd Infantry 6 men killed, 17 wounded, and another 4 injured. On the main coastal ridge between the village of Ibdi and the Parai Defile, the Biak detachment developed another center of resistance which came to be known as the Ibdi Pocket. The terrain in the area was a series of knife-like east wedge ridges separated by depressions and crevices up to 50 feet deep. These ridges were connected in places by cross ridges, and the entire area was covered with a thick rainforest and dense jungle undergrowth which had a foothold in the coral. Pillboxes of coral and logs, hasty emplacements of the same materials, small caves and crevices, and foxholes at the bases of the large trees were utilized by the enemy to defend the area. Back to the Wak Disarmy area, General Patrick was preparing to launch another assault on Lone Tree Hill. On the morning of May the 27th at 7 a.m., 2 destroyers firing on Lone Tree Hill and the Mafen Strip area started scheduled fire support for the day's advance. Artillery and infantry action on this morning was much more closely coordinated than the previous day. The destroyer fire lasted until 7:45 a.m., at which time the field artillery and all of the 81mm motors of the 158th Infantry laid concentrations on suspected and known enemy positions in the defile, on Lone Tree Hill and Hill 225. After this, Colonel Herndon sent his 1st Battalion against the defile between Lone Tree Hill and the eastern nose of Mount Saksin, and his 2nd Battalion against Hill 225. At 8:30, Company F, moving around Company E on the southern flank, started the attack. Behind close artillery support, apparently controlled by artillery liaison planes for the most part, Company F pushed up a terrain feature initially believed to be Hill 225. It was not discovered until late the next day that F Company was actually on the eastern nose of Mount Saksin, at about 700 yards east of the reported location. Since artillery fire had knocked out 2 enemy machine gun nests which had been delaying the advance of the patrols of Company F, they were able to reach the top of the eastern ridge. The rest of the company moved up the hill at 10 a.m., encountering scattered rifle fire from enemy positions to the southwest. Company E, just before noon, arrived atop the same hill on F's right. Company E had orders to secure the southern slopes of the defile between Hill 225 and Lone Tree Hill. Company B, still in the eastern entrance to the defile, was again unable to make any progress, and during the morning was held up by machine gun and mortar fire from concealed enemy positions on the southern and southwestern slopes of Lone Tree Hill. No sooner had some of these positions been eliminated by American artillery and motor fire than Company B was subjected to enemy machine gun and mortar fire originated from the northeast side of Hill 225, the reported location of Companies E and F. Actually, the artillery fire had not been entirely effective, because it had not reached into the deep draws or caves in which many of the Japanese weapons were emplaced. Company E, attempting to move down the northern slopes on the eastern ridge to Company B's aid, was soon forced back by enemy rifle fire and infantry counterattacks from the west. At the same time, small parties of Japanese, under cover of their own machine guns, started a series of minor counterattacks against Company B. Company F did not engage in this action. Instead, the company dug in on the ridge it was holding and sent patrols to the south and west to probe Japanese defenses. It was soon discovered that the combination of rugged terrain and Japanese machine gun and rifle fire limited patrolling to a very small area. North of Company B, Company A patrolled along the western bank of the Snaky River and on the eastern slope of Lone Tree Hill during the morning and early afternoon. At 4:30, the company moved in to force up Lone Tree Hill, finding the eastern slope of the hill unoccupied. Most of the fire that harassed the company during the morning had apparently originated on the beach below the northern face of Lone Tree Hill. For the night, the unit dug in on the crest of the hill. Again, little ground had been gained, although the eastern nose of Mount Saksin and Lone Tree Hill had been at least partially occupied. At the same time, Patrick was informed that 2 battalions of the 163rd Regiment would be shipped to Biak to reinforce Fuller on June the 1st, with General Kruger also preparing the 6th Division, led by Major General Franklin Silbert, to be dispatched to Wakde to replace the 163rd. Yet before this could all occur, Colonel Matsuyama crossed the Temuto River and he launched a surprise night attack against home. During a pitch-black night at 8:30 p.m., an estimated 100 Japanese struck the 1st Battalion's area. Divided into small groups, but with 2 major commands, they carried grappling hooks, knives, grenades, knee motors, and rifles. The grappling hooks had 2 prongs, like anchors, and they were attached to long ropes from which they could pull and explode booby traps harmlessly. A knee motor barrage began the attack. While the motors drove the men to the ground, the grappling hooks caught booby trap wires and exploded attached grenades. They struck from the southeast and the southwest, 2 different commands about 150 yards apart. First Command shouted wildly while they threw the grenades. They fired light machine guns down at A Company's street and holed up their tents. But this command's howling rush with grenades was just a feint to cause confusion. The second command, around 35 to 40 guys, made the main drive. Easily they broke through the 1st Battalion's far-spread perimeter holes. An estimated 25 made the serious penetration. They were trying to reach the regimental command post to kill the top officers. Some of the staff officers were actually cut off outside of their holes in a tent and thus unharmed. 10 Japanese almost reached the command post before they were all cut down. Such was the official report. But the 163rd reported that they had tried to blow up the mortar pool, nearly 100 of them. From a slit trench, 4 blazing M1s stopped them. From the mortar pool, Chief Sergeant Burton, Staff Sergeant Abretson, Private Switzer, Private Donsky, they all piled up about 13 dead Japanese, just 20 feet away from them. On a whistle signal, all Matsuyama's men had to withdraw. The wild attack prompted Patrick to not ship the 163rd towards Biak. The following morning, after another well-timed preliminary artillery bombardment, Herndon once again threw his forces against the Ilir Mountains. Yet the results were the same as before. Nonetheless, his troops would be able to cover the amphibious arrival of 2 tanks to aid in further attacks. But the situation soon became unattainable because of the strong Japanese counterattacks. All of his companies ultimately had to withdraw to the Snaky River line. On May the 29th, Kruger finally notified Patrick that his 2 battalions of the 163rd would have to leave for Biak the next day. So this would force Patrick to cease offensive action and withdraw the 1st Battalion, 158th Regiment, back to Rari. Yet further Japanese counterattacks also forced Herndon to withdraw his remaining forces to the Maffin area as well. He would have to form a new defensive line. Patrick ultimately disagreed with Herndon's decision to retreat, judging the withdrawal to be unwarranted, and he would relieve Herndon of his command, replacing him with Colonel Earl Sandlin. Colonel Herndon's fears of attack along his line of communications had been well taken, for the right sector force had begun flanking movements designed to recapture the entire Maffin Bay area. However, the combat engineers quickly proved their versatility by driving off the enemy force with rifle, carbine, and machine gun fire. 5 of the engineers were killed. Enemy casualties could not be estimated since the Japanese removed their dead and wounded during the night. The remainder of the night was more quiet, and the next morning the defenses along the Tirafome were improved. There was a couple of minor attacks during the afternoon, with some rifle and 70mm or 75mm artillery fire being directed against the American units still west of the Tor. The 147th Field Artillery Battalion withdrew to the east bank of the Tor late in the afternoon. Struck by some of the enemy artillery fire, they lost 1 man. A new defensive line along the Tirafome was being developed on May the 30th, as the bulk of the 163rd Regiment would depart for Biak. This left Patrick's forces spread almost entirely over 12 miles of coastline, just as Colonel Yoshino was about to launch his night attack. After the difficult river crossing, the 223rd Regiment had spent 3 days moving into the jungle southwest of Harare. From there, they were going to launch a series of simultaneous attacks against some anti-aircraft positions along the beaches. At 6:05 a.m. on June the 30th, a guard at B Battery's position, number 6, challenged 2 men in the jungle across the beach road. Other Japanese were moving west down the road. When they did not answer this challenge, he fired and he hit the ground. Instantly, Japanese machine guns, rifles, and motors, and even grenades hit the B6 position. The anti-aircraft men killed 10 Japanese, but 1 heavy machine gun jammed. The second gun became overheated and had to cease fire. The Japanese were hard to hit in the dark. They were heavily camouflaged with leaves and nets down to their hips. After 1 American was killed, the anti-aircraft men left their emplacement and they fled 500 yards east of the beach road to Battery A's position number 7. Joined with the men of A7, they had already stopped 1 attack. The B6 men helped fight another with about 15 to 25 Japanese. From 6:40 to 4:30 the next day, the Japanese struck intermittently, but rifle machine guns repelled them. Around 500 yards west of the B6 position, where the first attack occurred, Battery A6 had also endured harassment from Japanese mortar, rifle, and machine gun fire. At least twice the gunners repulsed these attacks. A 4th position, Battery B8, which was 400 yards west of A6, was assailed at 6:30 also. The anti-aircraft men's .50 cals, multiple heavy machine guns, became overheated and jammed. Rifle ammo was running out. Scurrying from the gun pit, they took cover in a shore brush until the Japanese left at 4:30. All attacks began about the same time, at around 8:30, and some men glimpsed a Japanese officer with a saber who was giving orders. All Japanese dead had rolls of white gauze in their mouths, and the Japanese officer had completely covered his lower face. The Americans thought that they had used these means to prevent them from shouting or screaming when they were wounded. While they attacked the anti-aircraft batteries, Yoshino's men also tried to storm the 1st Battalion 158th Infantry Protecting Task Force headquarters and their supply dumps. At around 7, rifle and machine gun fire began impacting the 1st Battalion's position. A captured heavy machine gun fired also. At 10, came a furious suicidal attack against B Company, beaten off with rifles, grenades, bayonets, pistols, and even some knives. They failed to fire at the supply dumps with demolition charges and Molotov cocktails. In the end, the Americans miraculously only lost 12 men, with 10 wounded, while inflicting heavy casualties upon the Japanese. Yet fearing more enemy attacks, Patrick would ultimately decide to reduce the number of separate perimeters along the beach from 21 to just 8. The bulk of the 158 had to withdraw behind the Tor, leaving only the 2nd Battalion west of the river to secure the beachhead. Facing little resistance, the Japanese recaptured Maffin, though they would be unable to push Sandlin's troops behind the river. Yoshino and Matsuyama were unable to coordinate their efforts, however, allowing the Americans to continue to strengthen their defenses for the next few days, with the Japanese only able to launch nightly raids against them that were easily repelled. On June the 5th, the first units of Major General Franklin Silbert's 6th Division also began to arrive, freeing up the 158th to continue their offensive. Sandlin then launched an attack with his 1st and 2nd Battalions supported by tanks crossing the Tor to attack Maffin on June the 8th, meeting increasingly strong enemy resistance from a line of hastily repaired bunkers and pillboxes. The tanks were able to reduce the Japanese defenses due to their strong firepower, but not before the Americans had to dig in by nightfall. The night passed without incident, and early on June the 9th, patrols began to probe westward towards the Tirfom. Scouts reported that the Japanese were holding another defensive line, including reoccupied bunkers and a slight rise on the west bank of the river. At 10 o'clock, tank infantry teams began to destroy the Japanese-held positions along the new line. While tank 75mm fire was destroying bunkers or forcing the Japanese to seek cover, infantrymen crept forward to toss grenades into bunker gun ports or to shoot down Japanese who tried to escape from the area. While these tank infantry teams' operations were taking place, the rest of the 2 infantry battalions rested. Japanese 75mm fire from a weapon emplaced on the beach between the Snaky River and Lone Tree Hill harassed the 1st Battalion for a while, but this fire was eventually stopped when a 155mm howitzer of the 218th Field Artillery Battalion scored a direct hit on the enemy piece. By 11:30, the enemy defensive positions had been cleared out, and the 1st and 2nd Battalions resumed their advance westward. Aided by fire from the 147th Field Artillery, which had supplanted the 167th, in the close support role, 2 infantry units probed cautiously forward. It was not until 3:30 that both reached the eastern bank of the Tirfom. Opposition was scattered, but the American units had 6 men killed and 6 wounded. It was estimated that 50 of the enemy had been killed and 1 was captured. At this point, the 158th would have to stop its advance because they received new orders from Kruger, who planned to employ the regiment for an assault on the Nomfor Island, 300 miles northwest of Sarmi, in late June or possibly early July. As such, advances west of the Tirfom would be postponed until a 2nd combat team of the 6th Division could arrive to the area to relieve the 158th in mid-June. General Sibert assumed command of the Tornado Task Force on June the 12th. On the 10th and 11th, the 158th Infantry limited its activities to patrolling, consolidating defensive positions, and driving the Japanese outposts westward. One outpost lying southeast of the 2nd Battalion was manned by about 100 Japanese that had been cleared by tank fire and infantry assaults. The Japanese, who were members of the 223rd Infantry Company, assigned to the Right Sector Force, fled towards Mount Saxon, leaving behind 4 heavy machine guns, 1 light machine gun, 2 75mm howitzers, and 1 37mm anti-tank gun. On the 14th of June, the 20th Infantry 6th Division relieved the 158th Infantry at Tirfom. The 158th recrossed over the Tor, and they went into a defensive perimeter on the western bank of the Temento Creek. Patrols sent south and east during the next week encountered a few stragglers from the Japanese garrison at Hollandia or from the Matsuyama force. On the 22nd, the entire regimental combat team was relieved of all combat responsibility in the Waktisarmi area and began their final preparations for the Nomfor Island operation. During its operations in the Waktisarmi area, the 158th Regimental Combat Team had lost 70 men killed, 257 wounded, with 4 missing. The unit took 11 Japanese prisoners and killed an estimated 920. With their supply line compromised, Yoshino and Matsuyama would also have to decide to withdraw from their present positions at about this time, which would allow the 36th Division to establish a better defensive position in the earlier mountains line. Yet that is all for Operation Tornado and Hurricane for today, as we now need to head over to the Impel-Kohima front. By June, the situation at Manipur saw General Slim's 14th Army losing all of their advantages. Despite the extreme odds, with a slim chance of success, General Mutaguchi continued his wild attacks against Impal. As it was, the 2 armies had just been battling it out in difficult terrain and conditions. There were the steep and often jungle-covered hills, the heat for men not accustomed to it, the risk of tropical diseases like malaria and the leeches, not to mention the weeks and months of both physical and psychological strain from fighting a formidable enemy. The monsoon rains that began later in May only made matters worse. As the days passed by, the low-lying areas in the Impal Valley would flood because of the downpours, while the streams and small rivers everywhere would become raging torrents. The water level of the Loktek Lake would also rise, making it especially uncomfortable for the units on both sides to dig in around the lakeside villages of the Tindam Road. Dysentery and diarrhea became an ever greater concern. Foot rot would also start to set in for the men in their flooded positions. The slopes in the hills became slippery, and that much more treacherous to navigate. The incessant rains would dissolve the stretches of fair-weather roads and jeepable tracks into mud, slush everywhere, while triggering landslides in the hills. For the units on the higher altitudes like the Shanam Saddle, Point 5846, and the Urkel area, the nights would become shockingly cold and damp, adding to their misery. Yet things were undoubtedly harder for the Japanese, who had carried few supplies and didn't expect to be strung out fighting for so long. To the north, General Sato's 31st Division were withdrawing from Kohima towards Urkel, defying Mutaguchi's orders, with General Miyazaki providing rearguard at Viswima, while General Grover's 2nd Division pursued them. Miyazaki's men had held out Viswima until June the 12th before withdrawing to Maosongsang. They had held out at Maosongsang until June the 16th, before retreating to the last holding position at Maram. Over to the south, General Briggs' 5th Division were engaging Colonel Matsumoto's 60th Regiment, fighting brutally for control over the Impal-Kohima Road. The battered Japanese defenders were fighting tooth and nail to prevent the opening of this vital supply line. The 9th and 123rd Brigades pushed on. They would only be able to capture Zebra Hill on June the 7th. The following day, the 3 and 14th Punjabis made a wide hook and arrived on the road behind the Japanese lines by nightfall, where they would repel 3 heavy counterattacks. This would allow the 123rd to clear the hill positions near the Madbung and to link up with the Punjabis on June the 11th. The 9th Brigade made great progress during these days, pushing on to the Sartarmana by June the 13th. General Gracie's 20th Division was also attacking towards the Urkel Road during this period, with the 80th Brigade advancing northwards towards the Kamang up to the Iril River Valley on a wide encircling movement towards Litan, while the 100th Brigade attacked up the road towards Kassam. Although the 80th faced little resistance, the 100th would struggle to progress against the fierce counterattacks of the recently arrived 67th Regiment. By mid-June, the 51st Regiment was also ordered to abandon their position to support the 67th at the Urkel Road. Over in the southwest front, the arrival of reinforcements in the form of the 2nd Battalion, under the command of Colonel Yanagisawa Kanji, at the end of May gave General Tanaka a gleam of hope that he could launch another offensive in early June. On June the 6th, 4 battalions under Colonel Sasahara attacked the 63rd Brigade's hill positions, applying such great pressure, General Cohen was forced to withdraw his brigade to the Bishampur the following day. On June the 7th, Tanaka ordered his recently arrived reinforcements to clear the Ningthok-hong and to retake Potsang-bam, yet their first coordinated attack would end in absolute failure. The attack was almost single-handedly held by Sergeant Hanson Victor Turner of the 1st West Yorks. Defending his platoon's position on the perimeter, Turner grabbed some grenades and charged forward, throwing them at the Japanese. He did this about 5 times, going back to gather grenades each time and returning to attack in the face of Japanese grenade and small arms fire. He was tragically killed on the 6th while throwing a grenade. For his bravery, Turner was posthumously awarded a Victoria Cross. The Japanese eventually captured some ground in the North Ningthok-hong, but withdrew after being hit by aerial and artillery bombardments. In the meantime, after the Japanese defeat at the Gibraltar Box, the Yamamoto Detachment would continue to harass the British Indian positions from Nepal and Scraggy Hills in early June. On the evening of June the 9th, the Japanese put in their last major attack against Scraggy, starting with a heavy artillery bombardment. Artillery concentrations were directed at the Japanese, and an airstrike was made on their part of Scraggy and Lynch. The Gurkhas followed up with an advance. Although some ground was recovered, the Japanese maintained their grip on Scraggy's crest. Having suffered many casualties and feeling that the Gurkhas' new position was sufficiently strong, General Roberts then decided to halt the counterattacks, thus leaving General Yamamoto in control of Scraggy up until the end of July. Concurrently, as a last hope to break through towards Impal, Mutaguchi was planning to conduct a desperate offensive on Palel, with some reinforcements that would fail to arrive in time. Due to these delays, he would end up sending some of Yamamoto's exhausted troops to recover Langol and to advance to a hill northeast of Palel. The Japanese managed to get beyond Langol, and they attacked some positions in the foothills near the Palel airfield, but they were soon rebuffed. They finally sent in a commando raid on the airfield in early July, which succeeded in blowing up 8 planes. Over in Ningthok-hong, Tanaka launched another heavy assault on June the 12th. Though a salient on the other side was initially captured, a ferocious counterattack would ultimately evict them. This action was performed by units of the 48th Brigade, including reinforcements sent from Ponsang-Bam. Rifleman Ganju Lama of the 1 and 7th Gurkha Rifles would earn a Victoria Cross during this action. Over to the west, Tanaka ordered the newly arrived 151st Regiment of Colonel Hashimoto Kumakoro to attack the British piquettes overlooking the Sochar track. After a wave of assaults, Water Piquet would fall on June the 21st. Yet the 32nd Brigade would respond immediately with a series of counterattacks that developed into confused fighting as positions were won and lost by both sides. On the night of June the 25th, no less than a company of Japanese began attacking Motor Bluff, a piquet position bereft of cover and a short distance away from the water piquet. It was held by a small garrison of some 40-odd men of the 2 and 5th Royal Gurkha Rifles, who had replaced the 7 and 10th Bulachis. In the pouring rain, the Japanese first bombarded the position with mortars and guns at point-blank range. For the next few hours, the infantry repeatedly attacked and surrounded the dwindling garrison. Subedar, Netra, Bahadur, Thapa defended the besieged position almost throughout the night, organizing counterattacks with whatever ammunition and grenades they had left. The Japanese finally overran Motor Bluff the next morning, with Netra Bahadur Thapa fighting to his death. He was posthumously awarded a Victoria Cross. A few hours later, a company of the same unit formed a counterattack against Motor Bluff. In the face of heavy fire, Naikagan Singh Rai led his section in charging a Japanese machine gun post, killing its entire crew. They then recaptured Motor Bluff and neutralized a 37mm gun position and their crew. Rai now advanced on a Japanese bunker, and he killed its occupants, after which his company recovered the water piquet. For his actions that day, Rai won a Victoria Cross, the second of the 2 and 5th Royal Gurkhas Rifles that very same day. Faced with such counterattacks and intense artillery fire from the gun box, the last throw of the Japanese 33rd Division around the Silchar track ended in complete failure. This left Hashimoto and Tanaka empty-handed for their losses that they had suffered. Tanaka was forced to withdraw units before they were completely annihilated. On July the 2nd, the 214th Infantry, with only 400 effective remaining, completed their withdrawal to the area south of Nuyoktek, and the 151st was directed to move back to Leimane. Having been decimated by sickness and straggling en route to the front, the strength of the entire 151st Infantry Regiment was at that time less than just 100 men. Back in the north, Briggs units continued to struggle for control of the Satar Maina area. The struggle over the next week centered around the main feature east of the road, the hill named Liver. The 3 and Night Jats attacked repeatedly to try and dislodge the Japanese from this feature. One such attempt was made on June the 15th, when Hurricane bombers strafed the hill, followed by heavy artillery concentrations from 25-pounders, 3.7-inch howitzers, and 3-inch mortars. A Jat company climbed the hill, but they had to withdraw some 100 meters from their objective because of the heavy machine gun fire. At the same time, the 1 and 17th Dogras were sent off on a wide hook left of the road, and the 3 and 14th Punjabis were sent to secure the Octopus position by June the 20th. North of them, Grover's troops would also be able to break through the Maram, continuing south down the road on June the 20th, finally meeting the Dogras 2 days later. Absolutely beaten, Miyazaki had nonetheless fulfilled his task, and he could now withdraw east towards Ukril. Sato's rearguard fought determinedly. Often a few men with artillery pieces, grenades, and machine guns would take up positions on some high ground above the tracks, ambushing the British advance guards before melting away to repeat the performance a few kilometers further back. Or, as was often the case, remaining obstinately in their position until they were all killed. Few were free from disease and fatigue, but surrender played no part in these men's vocabulary. They fought on till overtaken by British bullets or bayonet, often, more than not, by starvation and exhaustion. But the 31st Division had literally fought itself to death. Exhausted men lay in pits unable to defend themselves. Suicide squads with anti-tank mines tottered towards the advancing Lee Grants and Stuarts to be mown down by the accompanying infantry or obliterated by shell fire. Although the battered 31st Division would manage to survive the Kohima disaster, General Sato would be relieved of his command, for he had refused to carry Mutaguchi's orders numerous times. As a result, Miyazaki was promoted to Lieutenant General and given temporary command of the division by the end of June. Meanwhile, though his men had resisted like absolute demons, Matsumura now had no choice but to abandon the road and retreat east towards Ukril, with what remained of his command due to the new threat to his north. On June the 21st, the Liver position would fall at last. Again, the Japanese positions were bombed and strafed from the air, this time by 3 squadrons of Hurricane bombers for over half an hour. The 4th and 28th Field Regiments, as well as the troop of the 8th Medium Regiment, fired a concentration on Liver that covered in its dust and smoke. 3 companies of Jats now went in, and yet this attack would also be held by the Japanese on and around Liver. They had had enough. However, by the next morning, they were found to have withdrawn from the feature. The Jats had suffered around 150 casualties that week, including 33 killed. The 15th Division would adopt a new defensive position at Okurel to cover the withdrawal of Miyazaki and Matsumura. The main force of the 15th Division now went into a defensive position in a line extending generally from Okurel towards Tongu, Shongfel, and Anshan, to the 35-24 pass in order to be in a position to cover and pick up the right assault unit and the Miyazaki detachment as they withdrew in the east. In order to hold the new defensive positions, all available men, including all of those in the rear service units, were thrown into the line. Finally, the Impao-Kohima Road was reopened. Slim knew, while the battle was not yet over, it had already been won. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Age of Conquest, The Fall and Rise of China podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Over there I just released a complete series on the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. Also, if you have a chance, please check out my booming Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel, where for as little as $2 a month, you get access to my exclusive Patreon podcast, early access to all of the content I create, and you get voting rights to see what I'll tackle next. So please go check it out. The landings at Biak was another Allied success. The first tank battle of the war in the Southwest Pacific area saw the American Shermans absolutely devastate Japanese Type 95s. Within the Burma front, General Slim was finally reopening the Impao-Kohima Road, spelling doom for Mutaguchi's failed offensive.